All right, hello and welcome in, everybody. Week 6 is officially wrapped up and in the books. Monday Night Football is still playing, so I guess just the Sunday games are in the books. I lied to you. But today we have the 25th episode of the Titans of Fantasy Football podcast. As always, Garrett Daigle here with me, or I'm Garrett Daigle. With me is Caleb Armstrong. And like I said, week 6 wrapped up. Another exciting one in the books, and a lot of injuries throughout this weekend. So we're going to hit that first. We're going to change up our format a little bit and cut down on our studs and duds. We're just going to highlight the overall for the week, not necessarily go down position by position. But then we'll kind of run through teams on the bye, some waiver wire ads, droppable players, kind of the normal stuff we've been hitting. But we'll spend a little bit more time on that this week than we usually have been. So, Key injuries and big news with that type of stuff. Kayla, you want to start us off here?
First one is kind of a doozy. Big injury. Hollywood Brown, ankle injury, left the game early. He was carried off by 2 trainers, could not put any weight down on the ankle. It seems severe. And then we got news today. It sounds like he has a small fracture, actually better than what they thought. So he's going to need a small procedure of surgery. More than likely going to be back in 6 weeks. So should return after the week 13 bye. So should be back week 14 for you, right around the playoffs if you're making it with him. But, Hollywood, like Garrett and I talked about last week, he was one of our early league winners. And I just saw actually a thing today, Garrett. And if he would have kept with his stats, like he was on pace for 119 catches, 1,400 yards, and 9 touchdowns this year, which would have been a solid year. But, we'll get into it a little bit farther down. That Cardinals offense is changing, especially this week. We'll kind of get into more about that. But, yeah, Hollywood Brown probably was your wide receiver 1 or wide receiver 2 on most rosters this year, and you're going to be losing him for a while.
Yeah, he was, I think, wide receiver 5 going into this week. And, I mean, as long as we're here, let's just touch on the other 2 big movements. Okay. You talked about DeAndre Hopkins coming back. That's obviously a huge one for this team. Hopkins has been a stud for a very long time. He's got a lot of loyal followers out there. But the other big news with this team, they went out and they traded for Robbie Anderson, who had an altercation with his coaching staff this past weekend in Carolina. It was obvious after he was kicked off the field that he was getting moved. So they quickly moved him over to the Cardinals, and the Cardinals, I think, are happy to have him at this point with that injury.
Yeah. It was kind of like a mini AJ Brown type moment. It was just weird the way it all went. And now DJ Moore knows what he has to do at least.
Poor DJ Moore.
Poor DJ Moore. And he knows there is release. And Robbie Anderson showed him the way.
Unfortunately.
Yes.
Unfortunately. That's the only way to get out of that poor situation down in Carolina. Another injury story from this past weekend. J.K. Dobbins had some knee tightness in his ACL leg, so he was out all last year with his ACL injury. Came back after a little bit of a quiet or slow start to the season. They kind of took it easy bringing him back. So knee tightness in that ACL leg, a little bit of an alarm bells going off kind of situation. Kind of in the same vein, it's rough to see that happen with a guy who's been coming back, and you were hoping to have a good week this week.
Yeah, and J.K. Garrett and I kind of talked about how we were avoiding him this year, and it was for reasons like this. He was rushing himself more back, I would say, than the athletic trainers were, and it seems like he wasn't fully ready yet. And we don't know the extent of this injury. He didn't get any touches in the second half. Kenyon Drake kind of took over, which we'll kind of cover a little bit later on. But, definitely something if you're a J.K. Dobbins owner right now, you're probably thinking, not what you were hoping to see. Next big injury here is Kenny Pickett, goes down with a concussion. And it just seems like concussions are such a common injury so far already at the start of the season. We've seen a lot of guys getting down concussions. He was, looking pretty promising in his past couple starts. Obviously, the Steelers still won without him. Mitch Trubisky filled in nicely in the second half there, and the Steelers beat the Buccaneers, which was a big upset. But Kenny Pickett sucks, concussion, might miss a week, but probably you in most one QB or redraft leagues and stuff, you probably didn't have Kenny Pickett starting anyways, but could hurt your value for the wide receivers more than likely.
Yeah, and another guy in the same concussion conversation, Tua Tagovailoa is expected to be back this week. They just announced today he is expected to be back and expected to start after a multi-week absence with his concussion problems.
Yes, which is good to hear him back actually this quick, considering how hot he started at the beginning of the year. But also in that same boat with that team, they are being really cautious about concussions so far in the league ever since the first Tua episode. The Dolphins, Teddy Bridgewater actually cleared concussion protocol before Sunday's game, and he was actually brought in as to be their backup quarterback. Well, we saw Skylar Thompson go down with a concussion, and Teddy Bridgewater filled in nicely. So that was kind of goofy to me. Like, okay, if Teddy is healthy, why wasn't he starting? Maybe they had just more faith in Skylar Thompson, but
yeah, that was such a strange situation because typically with concussions, it's like either they're in or they're out.
yeah,
So to see him come in and start off in a backup role, that's almost like the situation reminds me of something where somebody's got like a sore ankle or a sore throwing shoulder or something like that.
yeah,
Not a situation with a concussion. That just
No.
it's so irregular with that.
yeah, for sure. Another big quarterback injury. This guy actually is surprisingly, he was QB9 going into this week, believe it or not. But Carson Wentz, if you watched the Thursday night game, which was another ugly Thursday night game, kind of follow up last week, of 2 weeks ago, I should say, with the Broncos and Colts game. Carson Wentz, if you saw, he kept doing something with his hand. It looked like it was like just he hurt his hand. But even before that, he was coming in the game with a bicep strain. Well, we found out he fractured his finger, and there's a couple reports that we saw, but mainly what I'm seeing is he's going to need some kind of a surgery and could be placed on IR out 6 weeks. We know that the Commanders have a reliable backup in Taylor Heineke. Maybe we'll see Taylor Heineke get the role, but if I got to feel the Commanders keep losing, we might see Sam Howell step in, and the Commanders might see what they got in Sam Howell before they enter draft, which seems likely they'll have one of the topper picks for quarterback next year. But Carson Wentz, fractured finger, like we said. One report that I did see, Garrett, which, like I said, was just misleading from all the rest. Don't really know what it means or not. But, and just with the extent of the injury was, he might only miss this week, I saw. Which I was like, because they said, depending if he elects to get surgery or not, if he can play through it.
So it could be one of those situations where, depending on the route he takes, he could be back sooner or later, and one might yield a better long-term or short-term.
Yeah. But then again, probably not the biggest fantasy impact-wise Carson Wentz, unless you're playing in like a 2-quarterback league or you were really relying on him as your QB1 this year. But like I said, he was shockingly at QB9, but Carson he's been hit or miss. So.
Yeah. Well, one thing with that is, we've seen plenty of Taylor Heineke the last few years. I feel like this could be an uptick for Terry McLaurin, who's off to a slow start to the season. Because those two have connected pretty well the last few years. And Terry, for being one of the higher touted receivers in the league, is off to a pretty quiet start to the season, even with Carson Wentz playing well.
Yeah, after week 1, I thought this wide receiving room was going to be just great, and I don't know, Carson Wentz looked good, but even ever since then, Curtis Samuel slid down. Yahad Dotson obviously is dealing with that hamstring injury, and maybe Heineke actually does. If anything, I think he helps McLaurin the most coming in because they have that strong connection. But I think we should probably see a little uptick for McLaurin, like you said, if Heineke is doubted the starter.
Yeah. All right, on to some receiver news here. Randall Cobb with the Packers. He has suffered a high ankle sprain, expected to miss several weeks here in the season. This is a team that has had, lots of injuries to the receiver corps so far. We've seen Christian Watson, the first-round pick, out. We've seen Sammy Watkins out. So this team is just kind of decimated at receiver right now. I expect a lot of Romeo Doubs in the future and a lot of the tight end in that offense,
Robert
Tonyan, who had a really big week this week. We'll touch on him a little bit later.
Yeah.
Same vein there, receivers. We're going to go down to the New Orleans Saints. Both Jarvis Landry and Michael Thomas, it sounds like they're both going to miss another week coming up. They play on Thursday, so another short week for them, but they are expected to miss again. Though Chris Olave, it was just announced that he is expected to start and play this week.
Garrett, question. Is this time to hit the panic button on Michael Thomas? They made it sound like it was nothing, right away, and now I think we're going on. This is either week 4 or week 3. I think this will be week 4 this week that he will miss. I don't think he's played since week 3. And so, is it turf toe? I'm guessing it's turf toe. They keep saying a toe injury, but Michael Thomas has dealt with a lot of foot stuff in the past 2 years. That's what's really held him out. So hearing that it's from that foot, it kind of worries me some, and that there's just been no clarity. They keep saying, Michael, like last week, the reports were after the week, Michael Thomas, who should be playing on Sunday. He never practiced it last week, and then out Sunday. So it's like, okay. And then already there's declare that Jarvis Landry and Michael Thomas aren't playing on Thursday. So that's like,
oh yeah, it's been terrible, and it just gives you kind of flashbacks of the last 2 years essentially, where he's been in and out. Where it's like, as soon as you feel like he's getting ready to come back, he hits you with this. Nope, the injury's still lingering again and still there. If he still has any value in your leagues, I'd be trying to shop him at this point, just because the reliability isn't there. And he's not a guy at this point that you can count on to get back anytime soon.
If somebody were to offer you George Pickens for Michael Thomas, would you take it?
I don't think I'd take that one.
Okay.
I don't.
What do you think value is
quite there?
What do you think value is around, like a Jacoby Myers? Would you take a Jacoby Myers?
I think I would take a Jacoby Myers. Jacoby's been pretty consistent in that offense, and he's been getting heavy targets. He is their number one, and he's actually getting some touchdowns this year, which is kind of a breath of fresh air.
Yeah.
It's hard because the way he started the season, it's like, okay, where does his value lie? 2 touchdowns and then 1 touchdown week 1 and 2 to open the season. But yeah, I think with some of those middling receivers, depending on your thoughts on Christian Kirk, I think you could move him for a guy like that. Christian Kirk started off with 3 good weeks and then has kind of faltered the last 3 since then. He had a touchdown this week, but wasn't as heavily involved. I think that offense, once they get their other receivers back, that could be one to kind of target in on.
Yeah, I agree. I like and Christian Kirk. If you want to just talk about that value there, I have Kirk in a couple of shares too, but his targets are still there. So that's like one thing to keep it in notice, and his snap share is still there. So yeah, I think that's like you're right. I think if you can sell for Michael Thomas right now for a guy that you view as a middle of the pack but higher upside play, that would probably be your best option right now with Michael Thomas. Getting into the concussion things again. Not as big of a deal, but I wanted to cover over 2 points. We talked about how bad the Panthers' offense has kind of been in general, besides CMC. But P.J. Walker, who was actually supposed to help DJ Moore because they had a strong connection last year, he goes out with a concussion. We saw Jacob Eason come in, and just basically it was all CMC from there on out. But P.J. Walker out with a concussion, and then also news that came out today is now we talked about a little bit last week about Baker Mayfield with a high ankle sprain. The new interim head coach, Steve Wilkes, said that there's going to be a quarterback battle. And I was just kind of talking about this with Garrett because we're like, well, who's Baker battling? Who's their quarterback? Well, supposedly Sam Darnold has a chance to return this week. Both, are not appealing picks there for to help that offense, really. But
But if Darnold is back, that could be an uptick for DJ Moore. It could be an uptick for CMC. We've seen him have those two guys have success with Darnold.
Yes,
It's not perfect, but
Darnold obviously had no connection with Robbie Anderson, who is not there anymore. But yeah, you're right. He had a lot of dink and dump passes to DJ Moore and or Christian McCaffrey, so could help those two's value.
Yeah.
Cameron Brate. I don't know if you saw this injury or not, and I wanted to cover this one a little bit. It was ugly. Left the game on a stretcher. It sounds like it's a neck and head injury. Probably, if you leave the game on a stretcher, you're probably out for a while. That's all I'm gonna say. I didn't hear too much about the extent of it all, but he hasn't had too much fantasy value this year in general. Actually, either him or Kyle Rudolph, but we'll talk a little bit later about Cade Otton and how, I think he was a 3rd-round pick or 4th-round pick and has showed promise when Brate has been out. So we'll kind of just get in a little bit later when we go over our waiver wire. Ruin that one a little bit, I guess, for my future waiver wire picks. But
that's all good.
Yeah.
The last one I had here for injury news that I want to touch on is Rams left tackle Joe Noterboom. He's out for the season with a torn Achilles. So, for an offensive line that's already seen some struggles to open up the year, Matt Stafford's kind of struggling with pressures and actually hitting his receivers and coming through some decent passing stats.
Yeah.
Now missing his left tackle, and them having to add in another piece to that offensive line, which has already seen a revolving door of players. Just not great for Stafford, not great for that offense. And kind of just segueing to that offense, Cam Akers this week, all of a sudden, Wednesday, Thursday, some drama stirs up, and all of a sudden there's just news. Cam Akers is done with this team. He's not suiting up for Sunday. He's not playing with. He's not expected to play another snap for the Rams, and they are now fielding trade offers on him. So Cam Akers, a 2nd-round pick from 2 years ago, is expected to be on the move.
Yeah, and that was, like you said, it was kind of totally out of left field on Thursday. There wasn't much talk about how it all happened and what broke down in the situation about with Cam Akers here. Did something happen where he was talking about getting more touches, blah blah blah. But McVay declined to talk about how Cam Akers is going to be involved in the future. So that is right there, red flags, and more than likely we saw our last days of Cam Akers in a Rams uniform. So Garrett already talked about this guy earlier. I want to talk about him. He was hinting jokingly about loyalty, and that's DeAndre Hopkins returning to the field. And it's been a kind of a joke for us and Garrett and I in our family league. I have had now DeAndre Hopkins for the past 7 years in a row in our family league. He's talking about the loyalty part, but honestly, if you're a DeAndre Hopkins fantasy owner, yes, it's very sad to hear about Marquise Brown, but they are in such need of him right now without Marquise Brown there, and this offense is struggling in general, that DeAndre Hopkins, if he kind of did see a little bit of downtick last year with his targets and yards, but his touchdowns were still there. If he comes back in and still gives you that goal line option and that red zone threat, he's immediately plugged into that wide receiver 2 probably for you, with wide receiver 1 upside if he gets back to his 2020 form, where I think he had 1,400 yards or something like that it was, Garrett. But, they are, like I said, they are struggling right now, this offense, and for him to return at this time is pretty dang lucky if you're one of his owners. And with a lot of bye weeks coming up, and especially this week with some huge buys, which we'll cover a little bit later too, the teams that are on buys, he can be a great fill-in option this week for you.
Yeah, Hopkins, for those who drafted him and waited, I think you guys are about to be rewarded for that kind of situation. I only got him in one of my leagues, and that one I am struggling in, and it's good to have him back.
Yeah.
But it's just for a situation that, Hollywood stepped in, he was playing admirably, but they have kind of been lacking that red zone threat so far in that offense. Last year it was Hopkins to start the year, and then it was James Conner the rest of the way throughout the season. James Conner has been dealing with injuries, and that offense has just kind of been lacking its, ticker, its identity.
Yeah.
So Hopkins is the kind of guy who drives that situation, and, if you got him at this point, be ready to fire him up.
Yeah, and like I told Garrett before the podcast here started, is big news is actually that not only about the Saints missing all its wide receivers, they're also missing Marshawn Lattimore, the number one corner, who has been a lockdown corner for the most of the time. So Hopkins comes in. I think he'll face, I think it might be Darby. Is there corner two, if that sounds right or not? But, he could potentially step in and face not so good at corners and could have a field day right away if he comes back fully 100%, ready to go. But, Garrett, what do you think about Robbie Anderson's value in this? Like, I would say he's more of a value now than he was in Carolina. He was droppable easily when he was in Carolina before, after that huge week one he had. But now, with Kyler and Hollywood out, I think he comes in and he steps in as a deep threat guy, which we've seen him excel at in the past. What do you think he is for value? Do you want to hold him? Do you want to stash him? Do you trust him in your lineups?
He's definitely a guy that I want to try to if he's on your waivers, he's worth stashing just to see kind of how things start up with this team once they get going. With Hollywood being gone, Hollywood is, he was succeeding in kind of every level for that team. But Rondale Moore has been playing pretty well the last few weeks, and I expect Rondale to be a big part of that offense, to go along with DeAndre Hopkins.
Yes.
We've seen Robbie Anderson be more of a deep threat, big play kind of guy, and I expect him to be more of like a Van Jefferson light. So
okay.
Van Jefferson last year with, the Rams, I thought he did a really good job at it, bringing the explosive plays, kind of deep threat. And kind of being Stafford's, go-to outside guy for those plays. I think Robbie Anderson could do something similar. He's not going to get all the attention on him, and plus he's got to learn the playbook, got to get up to speed, got to get in sync with that offense. So, there's going to be some growing pains to probably open things up, but, you don't necessarily need to go through all that process just to be on the field for some of those longer plays, to stretch the field, to open things up for the rest of the offense. So. Yeah. That's kind of how I view him, and I think that's a good route for him on this team.
Yeah. I think it's going to take him a little bit, obviously, to learn the playbook, get involved. But like we talked about, this team is in need of their players right now, and that offense is hurting. Like we talked about, James Conner has not really been there, so we'll see if Murray gets rolling now with these wide receivers. Going in, we talked a little bit, obviously we're talking about Panthers here with Robbie Anderson and whatnot. Let's cover CMC. CMC, it sounds like Carolina's open to trading, and that's basically, ever since Matt Rule left, now we got this new interim coach, they're turning this into a fire sale, it sounds like. It sounds like one of the only guys who is off limits, Garrett said, and I talked about, was actually Burns, which makes sense. He's a star edge. But Robbie Anderson was more likely going to get shipped. We knew that. Even before the incident. DJ Moore has been talks in trades. Now CMC sounds like he is on the block, but they want, if it's true, the rumors are they want 2 first-rounders or more, and that is a crazy return of investment. CMC, is he worth it? 26, but it showed this year, when healthy, he is top 3, if not top 1 running back in the league. He still put carving out almost over 100 yards. I think they said it now. It's been 18 games or 19 games in a row. He's had either 100 yards or a touchdown. That's just total yards. And this week, he didn't get down with his legs, but then again, he goes out and he gets, I think he had 8 or 9 catches for 90 yards. I mean, the guy is just explosive. But Garrett, correct me if I'm wrong here. And I know I'm going on a little bit of a rant, but the top teams that are potentially in trade rumors for CMC, Bills, Chiefs, Rams, 49ers, and I can't remember who else. Broncos. Those are the top landing spots for CMC right now. and just kind of cover what the worst spot for him, Garrett, that you think, and what is his best spot for fantasy value?
It's hard because honestly, for all those teams, there are some really good opportunities for him to get involved. I think of those, the one that he is probably the least relevant for fantasy is probably the 49ers, just because their running style and the fact that, their passing game isn't as, accelerated as some of the other ones. I feel like their rushing game is so involved with other players and utilizing guys, down down their depth chart. But honestly, looking at the rest of the guys in Denver, you take that situation. Russell Wilson started off the season throwing a bunch of passes to Javonte Williams. They've had some banged up running backs other than Javonte, who's already out. Yep. Jump over to the Bills. Yes, Singletary has been playing fantastic to kind of open up the season, but you add McCaffrey to that offense, he immediately becomes the one, and then they go from scary to legit a terror. Yeah. And it's the same thing down in Kansas City. Yeah, Clyde Edwards-Helaire kind of opened up the season playing decent, and then he's tapered off the last 2-3 weeks, and McKinnon has stepped in a little bit, but CMC goes into that offense, and it's a worlds different, so much better. He's the kind of guy who opens things back up for Mahomes and provides that intermediate threat that can help relieve stuff for Travis Kelce.
Yeah.
And they're just, if CMC gets moved to one of these higher powered teams, it is going to be darn right scary.
Yeah. And, the thing is with CMC, like, he just showed he's himself again, I would say. And I don't think that's what you drafted him for this year. That's why you took that risk of him not basically playing 2 years in a row, and he was still, I think his ADP was either 1 or 2 basically in most drafts. He was either first or second pick. And, he's still there. I honestly think if he was to go to the Chiefs, I think Andy Reid, like, just being the head coach he is and the play caller, just would unlock CMC to a level we've never seen before. And I know that's crazy considering he had probably one of the best seasons of all time. But he would probably be utilized so much in that passing game that he would, in PPR scoring for fantasy, would just be, I think, off the wall, good. That would be very, very good for him. But, yeah. So, Garrett, you talked a little bit about Akers. We won't go too much more into that. Darrell Henderson, obviously, if you have held Henderson, he's pretty much taken in now 70% of leagues, I think he is. So you're probably not likely to get him on waivers. If somehow he is, you better scoop him up if he's not there, and put a high claim on him, because Darrell Henderson last year, when Cam Akers was out, was literally locked into an RB1 role. I think he was RB11 in those first part of the season. So, and we saw again this week, he scored a touchdown, got about 16 touches. He's going to be locked in at that role unless somebody else is brought in. But this one is kind of going under the radar today for fantasy-wise, and it is big because Garrett and I were all in on this guy in the offseason, and he has started off the year incredibly slow, has been considered a bust in most drafts, and it's not his fault if you look at the metrics too much. And it sucks to say that, but he's just not getting those targets. And that's Elijah Moore. The Jets come into Green Bay yesterday, basically, control the whole game and upset the Packers 27-10. But Elijah Moore had 0 targets. 0. And that's coming after a week where he had 3 targets. And, we expected, Garrett and I were kind of pumped to see Zach Wilson come back. Maybe, him and Moore showed a strong connection there for 2 weeks. No, Elijah Moore has had a total of 6 targets in 3 weeks with Zach Wilson. And after the game, a sports analyst puts out there, kind of eye-popping that, Moore had 0 targets for this game. And Elijah Moore actually responds to him on Twitter and goes, and here's the quote right here: "If I say what I really want to say, I'll be a selfish guy. We winning. Grateful. Huge blessing. All I ever wanted. Bittersweet for him, but I'll be solid, so I'll just stay quiet. Just know I don't understand either." I know it's a lot to wrap your head around there, but he was pissed. You could see that straight out, small words. Put it down in a layman's term. He was not happy at that game. His game use.
Yeah, I love shit. I love stuff like this. It's just like every time they make a comment, it's I'm not going to say anything, but here I'm going to say something.
Yeah.
Obviously, he's unhappy with his usage. I mean, getting 0 targets for a guy who, he was talented last year. He had one of the best stretches down the middle of the season. And this offense, just their passing identity when they have Wilson, it just hasn't been terrific. But also, it was a little bit of the game script. They were up on the Packers early, and they were able to kind of run the ball pretty at will.
Yeah.
That being said, I think, obviously this isn't a great time from a team aspect and a PR aspect for Elijah Moore, but this team wants Zach Wilson to grow. They want him to become a premier quarterback in this league, and so I think that the long-term outlook of this team is not to have him throw for only 100 yards a game. They're going to find ways to get him more involved, and they're going to try to get these talented receivers, the young receivers that they have, and try to get them all involved in the passing game.
Yeah.
But, it's funny after a week like this where the team comes out and they have a nice statement win for one of their key young players to come out and say, I'm not going to say anything, but I'm bothered.
But I'm not trying to overreact to this situation here, but we have seen this more times than not, where this leads to a potential trade. And I'm like I said, I'm not trying to overread into this too much. When guys become unhappy, it carries on and carries on and carries on to the point of where they ask for it or something like that. I don't think Elijah Moore is there yet, obviously, but if I saw a thing today and it is true, I looked it up and did everything behind it. Since Zach Wilson's return, Garrett, who's the highest scoring fantasy wide receiver on the Jets?
Corey Davis?
Braxton Berrios.
I had it in the back of my head. I'm like, it better not.
So not Garrett Wilson, not Elijah Moore, not Corey Davis, Braxton Berrios. And it's because he's got 2 rushing touchdowns. And nobody, I don't think, I should say nobody, but because I was thinking about it too. But I don't know the easiest way to put this. For Breece Hall to become this dominant is just basically what I'm saying is they have just, I think, completely focused their offense around him right now and Michael Carter. That tandem has been solid for the Jets. And, Breece Hall has been just everything they asked for and more, and everything we hyped up about this offseason and more. And Michael Carter has been great at, filling in the voids and, doing little rotational pieces here too. So, yeah, we went a little bit farther or a little bit more into that than we probably were expecting, but it needed to be talked about, I think.
Yeah, it does. It's all good. The last news section we had for today was just discussing Odell Beckham Jr. as he gets ready to return from his injury and some of the landing spots we can expect for him. I think the one that's been the loudest thus far, I feel like, is the Bills.
Mm-hmm.
I know that there's a lot of talk out there about Von Miller trying to recruit Odell from their days with the Rams, and them essentially saying, he's trying to find another team that he can win on. But I hear that a big portion of his, eventual landing spot is contract again.
Yep.
The most recent thing I heard is that, he's looking for something similar to Michael Gallup, who was signed after his ACL tear. Because it is somewhat of a similar situation, but Odell is a little bit older. Caleb, any other thoughts on Odell and his landing spots?
Not too much there. We covered it a little bit last week, but I'm happy you talked about the contract. For those of you who don't know, Michael Gallup's contract was a 5-year, $62 million contract. So Odell is coming into I think he's 29 right now, but he'll turn 30 right at the beginning of next year. And for him to sign a 5-year deal, that's a lot for a team to put on for a guy who's had 2 ACL tears and is almost 30 years old. We saw last year Odell can still play at a high level, but we don't know what he'll look like after this ACL injury. So, Garrett and I, like Garrett mentioned earlier in the podcast, we didn't want to go too deep into our studs and duds episode. We felt like that took a lot of our time out of this big news, and we wanted to get more of this, juicier content, more relevant content out there for you guys. So we just shrunk it down, and we're still going to keep it in football, but we're going to be calling it Team Stud, Team Dud. So we're just going to give you not all the breakdown of stats, but just 2 or 3 guys from each thing who basically, if you were to fill out a fantasy roster, that's what the dream roster would have looked like, kind of.
Mm-hmm.
Garrett, I'll let you do the studs here.
All right, so the studs, just running down the line, we have Matt Ryan, Joe Burrow, Deion Jackson, Ramondre Stevenson, Jamar Chase, Tyreek Hill, and Michael Pittman were very close together, and then Mark Andrews.
Yeah.
Big juicy lineup for this week. I think, is of these, I would say the most surprising was Deion Jackson stepping in, just because of how slow Taylor started the season.
Yeah.
He just had a monster day, but I think a lot of it was on the back of Matt Ryan throwing 58 times, 10 of those going to Jackson.
Yeah, for Matt Ryan, for how bad he's been on our duds category for, I think, 4 weeks or 3 weeks now it has been. And for him to come out and throw for a team that absolutely shut him down week 2, to come out and throw for almost 400 yards and 3 touchdowns when they had basically no running back help again, that was huge. And then for them to seal a win was even bigger, like you said. But for old Matt Ryan just to air it out, like you said, Deion Jackson had 10 of those. Michael Pittman had 13. So, pretty impressive week. Our duds.
And real quick before we jump out of here, Ramondre Stevenson looked absolutely fantastic this week. For him getting the opportunity to be the bell cow in this offense, he stepped up and he looked fantastic. Not only just as a fill-in runner, but legit as a guy who could be a premier running back in this league.
And we saw it last year. I don't think it was too big of a shocker. We saw it last year in those later on in the year when Harris had a couple injuries, and he just showed again why he was kind of, he got a little hype this year in the offseason, and it was well-deserved. Because Ramondre, when he gets the bell cow role, like you said, I mean, he's an RB1. He gets a lot of touches, and he's good in the passing game. He gets touchdowns, and just, all in and around. Our duds for this week, Carson Wentz, which we talked about, did not look good. Might have been dealt with his hand. He was dealing with his finger all game, too. Geno Smith, who Garrett and I were hyping up last week, didn't do it wasn't a bad game, honestly. He was mistake free, but he just threw for very little yards. And it was kind of a game script. They really ran the ball heavily with Kenny Walker, who was what they drafted him to be. So, Geno wasn't quite there. Clyde Edwards-Helaire, we're finally starting to see that what he should be, because he was so overachieving at the beginning of the year. He just got a lot of touches, or not a lot of touches, but was getting touchdowns. And now you're seeing him come back down to earth. A.J. Dillon and Aaron Jones, both running backs, got very little touches again this week for the Packers. Packers offense seems to be struggling. Earlier in the year, when they were both getting touches, they were both very relevant. Now it seems like their touches are just dwindling. I think Aaron Jones, they said, had only 3 touches in the whole first half. So a guy that you probably drafted in the first or second round to be your RB1, maybe RB2, not what you're looking for.
Thanks.
But then with Geno Smith, 2 wide receivers who've been killing it all year, Tyler Lockett, DK, both have really down weeks, not good. MVS is our last wide receiver. From him having a big week, now to have 0 catches, not what you want, that inconsistency. And then Dallas Goedert, who has been shockingly, or I guess not really shockingly, but who has been solid all year. For him to have a down week, okay, it is what it is, but not too big of a deal there. So that's our team duds.
Oof. Next section we're going to touch on here is teams on bye next week.
Yep. So the buys started this last week was our first week of buys, NFL teams hitting their bye weeks. So you might have to revolve your rosters around picking up waiver wire guys, doing a quick stardom or, going on your bench. Like I mentioned, this week is a big week for fantasy for buys. The Rams, Vikings, and Eagles and Buffalo Bills all have buys. So 4 teams on a buy, all pretty high-powered offenses, and all who have big players that are in your roster. Garrett, what's your key strategy to revolve around these buys? What do you try to do?
Well, the big thing is keying in on here is the quarterback situation, because you have four quarterbacks here who are probably rostered and started in a lot of leagues. I mean, Matt Stafford might not be at this moment, but Kirk Cousins, Jalen Hurts, and big boy Josh Allen, those 3 right now are quarterbacks who are started in most leagues. So trying to fill in for that kind of situation, in this situation, you just want to find somebody who's got a strong matchup and try to find teams that have opportunity out there for guys to step in. So whether it's Tua coming back from his injury or a different situation out there, but it's tough because you're never going to replicate the type of production you're going to get from those big dog number ones, especially this year.
Yeah. I agree with you there. Like you said, I think 2 of the top 3 fantasy-wise quarterbacks will be out this week. Jalen Hurts is QB3 right now, and Josh Allen still at QB1. So that really stinks if you have one of those guys, but at least you're getting it done with early, and hopefully you have a good record to this point where maybe a loss this week doesn't hurt you as much. Waiver wire ads. Let's get into it. Before we get too far, sorry. I just want to point out, I feel like this is kind of a bad week for waivers. There are not a lot of great, juicy options. I wouldn't go spending if you're in a fab-type waiver system. A lot of these guys we're going to be saying, maybe besides 1 or 2, you probably don't really want to have to spend too much of your fab with these guys, and it's probably not quite worth it to spend all that fab, too. So,
absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's just such a great point for this week, because, all these guys are kind of shot-in-the-dark guys, or guys who are worth stashing. There's only 1 or 2 who I would go out there and say that are guys that I really want to make sure I get on my squad.
Yes.
But yeah, it's kind of slim pickings this week. So I make sure that if you're throwing bids out, they're low ones, and you're not, being too willy-nilly with those fabs.
Yes. Agreed. So our first guy, we talked about the knee tightness with J.K. Dobbins. Kenyon Drake got the majority of the touches after that, and he did well. For Drake, who has been with the early touches he got at the beginning of the year, did not look good at all. For him to have a game like this was kind of shocking. He had 10 carries for 120 yards and a touchdown. He did break a 60-yarder, which a lot of the yards came from, but he was still good on his other touches. He was still averaging right around 6 or 7 yards rip. So for that, it's solid. The one thing I want to point out, though, with Kenyon Drake is before you go dipping all your fab onto him, there's a guy on that team who I like a lot better, and you probably get for cheaper, actually, and if he's not stashed already on a roster, but who has value for the whole season, and that is Gus Edwards. He was cleared from practice, actually, last week, but then he's going to be playing this week, it sounds like, and they did not rush Edwards back compared to Dobbins, which was kind of shocking. They really milked him out in the way his recovery. He only had an ACL tear, where Dobbins actually had more of the whole works down there tear. So for him to come back later at a time, he's probably going to be a little healthier, which I would say. And Gus Edwards, which Garrett and I pointed out way back in the beginning of the year when we were talking kind of about our guys who we like to stash and potentially sleeper picks. Edwards has had almost 800 yards 3 years in a row. Even with all those other running backs there, he's been so consistent that he's going to get his role back, probably. He's going to have a role in this offense regardless.
Yeah, he's been a great fill-in flex player, for years now. And if we do see Dobbins out for longer with that flare-up or that tweak, yeah, I think Gus Edwards could have great season-long value.
Yeah.
2 guys who are kind of exactly similar situations here. We have 2 second-round pick receivers who are actually drafted a lot higher than expected. Both guys had 37 yards and a touchdown this week, and in kind of their first week back in action. So
Yeah.
Tyquan Thornton from the New England Patriots and Wan'Dale Robinson from the Giants. Both of these guys have pretty good opportunity to step into their offense. Thornton ran a lot of routes in his return. He was used in both the rushing and the passing game. And then Wan'Dale, he had really good usage based on the amount of snaps that he had, because he was only involved with 23% of the offensive snaps, so really low. But as he gets returned from injury and steps back into this offense, their receiving core is decimated. They've had tons of injuries. They're just looking for somebody with a spark. And Wan'Dale looked pretty electric out there this weekend. He was exciting. Great stash, I think, for both those guys.
I'm sorry, Garrett. I was kind of interrupting there, but I was telling Garrett on, I think it was Saturday, I called him, and we were kind of talking about some fantasy football, and I talked about Wan'Dale and how I liked him, because Garrett scooped him up in one of our leagues to stash him, and I said, God, I wish I would have known when he was available. I didn't even think he was available, because Wan'Dale Robinson actually, I'm almost 100% certain on this, and his last 2 years of collegiate football, he led all of collegiate football in total yards. And Garrett talked about this too. He was used as a running back too. So we could see him a little bit more involved. And for him to actually come out and, like Garrett said, only play 23% of 23% of the snaps and tie the team high receivers for targets, that's what you want to see for usage. And to see that productivity all coming together. His snap percentage is bound to increase with this basically vacant wide receiver room, and if he becomes that spark in the offense, he could really bring some life into your fantasy lineups.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
This next wide receiver here is a guy I would spend very little money on, but this is a great bye week filler. This is why I put him on here. I put him on here for the waiver wire because he's a great solid. If you're missing a guy like Cooper Kupp or Diggs, losing a big guy, and you really don't have much on your bench that you want to grab and throw in, Traquan Smith from the Saints. Not a juicy name. He's been around for a while, but Garrett and I talked about Michael Thomas and Jarvis Landry being out. In week 3, when Landry and Thomas both went down in injuries, he played a lot of the second half. Traquan Smith did. He ended the game with 4 catches for 105 yards and a touchdown. This week, he operates as a wide receiver, or this past week, he operated as a wide receiver 1 for the Saints in a game where they didn't throw the ball much. He had 3 catches for 43 yards and a touchdown. So, coming in, it sounds like he'll be operating as wide receiver 2, but like we talked about, there's not much wide receiving help there, and it's a big bye week. So he's a guy you could grab for pennies and put in as your flex play, and he could potentially give you some value in a possible touchdown. So that's what you're looking for.
And, Chris Olave is expected to return, but we've seen, these concussion protocols going around right now, and it's tough to know exactly what's going to happen. There's a chance that, he could get pulled before the game, or he could get sat, or, there's an opportunity if something bad happens where he has something happen again, if he were to take another shot. But Traquan, good fill-in for the week, especially if you're one of those teams with the bye. Now, here's a guy that I think I would love to throw some fab at, Rondale Moore. This past week, he had 6 catches on 10 targets, low yardage, 49 yards. But they try to give him the ball in space and get him involved in different ways. So with the Hollywood injury, he's been playing a ton of snaps since he's been back from his injury and returned to the field. So Rondale Moore, with the running backs out, we could see him in the backfield more, getting involved in, plays out of the backfield. And then, with no Hollywood, he's going to be more involved in the passing game. With Hopkins coming back, getting back up to speed and kind of acclimating, Rondale could have really great season-long value and a guy that you could rely on for the next 6 weeks plus. And, I think he's worth a good chunk of your fab.
And surprisingly, he's only taken in 40% of the leagues. He's only rostered in 47% of the leagues. So for a guy who we talked about last week on our waiver wires, if you were able to listen in and scoop him up early, you're going to be greatly rewarded, like Garrett talked about. He has that value now where he can have basically season-long value, depending on even more. He could carry you into the playoffs too if Hollywood's injury is worse than we think. So that is kind of one that you want to definitely. This is the one that we talked about. Like, there's only one or two guys on this list. That's one of them who, if you got some fab dollars, don't be afraid to spend them on a guy like Rondale Moore.
Yeah.
This guy is next guy here, Garrett. Has surprisingly been playing a lot and has been slowly getting a larger and larger and larger role. And you can get him for cheaper because he's on a bye week. We talked about Josh Reynolds last week on how a guy you want to stash and like you put on your roster. Ben Skronik for the Rams. You're like, who the heck is that guy? If you don't really kept up too much with the Rams, he has been playing a large role. He's actually played over 80% of snaps all year. So he's been having that like wide receiver 3 type role for all year. This week he ends up with 5 catches for 40 yards, and then he also has a run for a touchdown. But we've seen him, just like I said, he's getting a lot of that goal line work. He's a bigger wide receiver. His value, though, like I said, I wouldn't put a lot of down on him because it can definitely change when Van Jefferson comes back. We can see his value take a little hit there. But I don't know when their timetable is for Van Jefferson. I haven't heard a whole lot of Van Jefferson. Maybe he'll be back after the bye. We don't know. But this guy probably can just put a free waiver claim in on him. And if you can get him, just hold him for a week. It ain't going to hurt.
Yeah. Another guy, I would say he's a really great option. This plays a tight end. He's a really great option if you were a Tyler Conklin owner, somebody who, you started off with somebody that was okay, or you had a tight end that was doing fine to open up the season, but now is cooled off. Daniel Bellinger from the Giants comes out this week, 5 catches, then 38 yards and a touchdown, 94% snap rate, which was his highest of the year. Seems like he's warming up. We already talked about the opportunity for targets in that offense and the passing game. They're looking for guys to step up, and Bellinger did it in a big way this week.
Yeah, at back-to-back weeks, actually, he scored touchdowns. And they use him in a multiple different, ways. He was kind of one of the higher-ranked, I would say, tight ends coming into the draft this year, the rookie drafts. And I think he was a 4th-round pick here by the Giants. And last week, we saw him kind of run like a pass option, and he ran it in for a touchdown. This week, he comes out, leads a team in targets, and gets another touchdown. So, this guy, like Garrett said, he could have that streaming potential here for a while if he keeps this roll up, and especially with that depleted wide receiver room. Mm-hmm. This guy, the second guy here, is the only other one I would probably drop some fab on, and I think it's a safe. The way he played this week, you got to feel like it's going to be a safe role going forward for him, and that is Robert Tonyan, who Garrett kind of talked about here. He got dropped in a lot of leagues because he started off the year real slow, but he was returning from ACL injury, and this week he looked a little bit more explosive. Looked a lot more involved in the offense, and we know he has Aaron Rodgers' trust, and he had 10 catches on 12 targets for 90 yards, by far the most of the whole Packers team for targets and catches. But without Randall Cobb there, Rodgers literally has Lazard and Tonyan right now, who are probably trusted receivers for him. Dobbs is starting to earn his way into that role too, but Tonyan had a big game in the fact of 12 targets from Aaron Rodgers. That's what you will want to see. And for the tight end position, which has always been thin, that is something worth value.
Yeah. And then the last guy we had on this list was Cade Otton. Definitely a guy, with that Cameron Braid injury and him probably going out for, an extended time. Cade Otton stepping into that tight end role for this Buccaneers offense could see a lot of opportunity and could be a good stash, again, if you're somebody who's desperate for somebody to jump in and just throw a dart at the board.
Yeah. He had a solid week in week 5 when Brate missed. I think he had 6 catches for 43 yards and a touchdown. So we've seen him already have a solid performance when Brate was out. Into our last section here, and we talked about it last week, how we were going to give you guys some guys we think you probably drafted at either higher mid-value, and, you could drop these guys. Now, it's time has come where they're no longer, we're deep in the season here, and if they are not producing, you can probably cut bait on them. So our first one here was Jarvis Landry. Blew up week 1 for the Saints. Looked like he was going to be the kind of the big wig there. And, after a solid preseason we hear about and how he looks so good, he's been dealing with injuries. He hasn't been that productive in the past couple games he has played. And it's time where, he no longer needs to be rostered.
Yep. Cole Kmet, that passing offense for the Chicago Bears, pretty much non-existent. Cole Kmet was a dart throw to start the year as a guy who could potentially step forward. Has not been that guy.
And then this next one here is a quarterback. He finished really well last year. This year has just not been it, and that has been Matt Stafford. And especially with the bye week coming around, you can more than likely find a streaming option who has been putting up the same productivity as Matt Stafford. You can probably cut bait with him, and like I said, unless things start changing here, Matthew Stafford could definitely flip a switch after the bye and become where he was like a gunslinger like last year, but it just has looked that way, especially with that offensive line like Garrett mentioned with no boom injury.
Yep. And then another quarterback we have here, Carson Wentz, off to a pretty hot start to open up the year. He was a top 10 quarterback entering this week. With that hand injury, potentially missing several weeks here, anywhere from 1 on the easy end or 6 kind of on the worse end. We have him listed here as a droppable player. Same thing Caleb said with Stafford. Look towards some other streaming options and other quarterbacks that are stepping up. There's good opportunity out there to find another guy who can give you a top 12 week.
Yeah. Cam Akers on the next one here. And even if Cam Akers gets traded, it's not likely he's going to end up being the RB1 on most teams where he lands. So his value right now is not good to begin with. He hasn't looked good when he has played. So you're more, and even if he stays on this Rams roster, he's not going to get playing time. I mean, that sounds like that relationship's over and done with. Ship has sailed. You can cut him. No longer needed.
Yep. Another guy we just talked about, Elijah Moore. So far to open up the season, it's been really rough sledding. We had hoped going into the year that he'd be a guy that you could plug and play, but throughout the start of the season so far, we're 6 weeks deep and he doesn't have a week over 6 points. That's not exactly what you need out of that guy and not exactly what you're hoping for. So with that offense not passing the ball enough, Elijah Moore is droppable.
So these next two I kind of put together in one category, Garrett. And if you were on fantasy Twitter at all this week or in the past weeks, they've talked a lot about these guys and the fact that they both were highly drafted and just were crap. They were both, actually, Garrett and I were figuring out our week, kind of talking about it last week, who we thought would potentially be. Both these guys were names on here, Darnell Mooney and Allen Robinson. Well, they both kind of have bounce back weeks. Garrett and I talked, A-Rob's probably a sell high right now because, he finally had that good game. Mooney, though, you can probably hold because if he gets 12 targets like he did and his target productivity has been going up, he's not worth dropping. But Allen Robinson, sell high, scored a touchdown, has 6 targets, you can sell him. I wouldn't drop him because probably more than likely somebody would actually give you something for Allen Robinson. But
yep. And then the last guy on our list here, a tight end who opened up the season doing all right. I referred to him earlier, Tyler Conklin. The last 3 weeks, he had 52 yards on 3 catches, 0 yards on 0 catches, and 16 yards on 1 catch, which has just been an abysmal turn for Mr. Conklin since, Zach Wilson has taken over. So we gave you guys a list of tight ends you can turn to if he was somebody that you had started to run with. But, yep, Tyler Conklin, officially droppable.
And next week, Garrett and I are going to cover about some risers, some players who can help you make that mid-season push to win it all, and guys who will be there for you come by weeks and such.
All right. That middle of the year, I feel like there gets to be a point where, guys in your league start tuning out a little bit. They go into autopilot mode for a few weeks. So that's when you want to push hard and try to, put your stamp on the league and try to get your leg ahead if you can. But yeah, that's kind of a wrap for week 6. Thanks everybody for tuning in. Yeah, another exciting one in the books, but we look forward to talking with you next week.